locks, he said. Now be quiet so I can pick this lock. Marlowe looked around nervously, but didn't say anything. He turned his attention back to the door, listening for the telltale clicks of the tumblers falling into place as he carefully made his way through the mechanism. This is taking forever, Marlowe whined. I didn't say I was good at this, he said absently. Got it. He grinned triumphant. The door opened with a creak, revealing a wide hallway with a gentle upward slope. The hall itself was dark, but a few yards ahead they could see the dim glow of fluorescent lights. Marlowe pulled the door closed behind them, cushioning it with a hand so that it wouldn't slam. The light was coming from an open door on the left side of the hall. They waited, but no sound came from its direction, and they started to move, hugging the wall. As they got closer, Carlton sniffed the air. Shh, Marlowe hissed, and he jerked his head toward the door. Pizza, he whispered. Can you smell it? Marlowe nodded, and impatiently waved him forward. Of all the smells in this place, that's the one that catches your attention. The open door proved to be the kitchen, and they glanced around briefly. Then Carlton went to a large refrigerator and pulled it open. Carlton, forget the pizza, Marlowe said in dismay, but the refrigerator held only racks of ingredients. Carlton closed the door. You never know who could have been hiding in there, he said quietly, as they exited the kitchen. At the end of the hall was a swinging double door, with small windows just at Carlton's eyesight, and he surveyed what he could see of the next room, then pushed the door open. Marlowe gasped. Creepy, Carlton said mildly. The dining room in front of them was lit with the same dim fluorescent light, giving the brand-new place an odd dullness. There were tables and chairs at the center, and arcade games and play areas along all the walls, but the eyes were drawn immediately to the small stage at the back corner. Its purple curtain was pulled open, and it was empty, except for a bright yellow rope strung across the front and a sign with a picture with a clock on it. Next show, it read in neat, handwritten letters, but the clock had no hands. Marlowe shivered, and Carlton nudged her. It's not the same, he whispered. It's exactly the same, she said. Carlton looked around at the rest of the room, his eyes lighting on a ball pit that stuck out from the front wall in a half circle, a round red plastic awning arcing over it, trimmed with white. Look at the monkey bars, she pointed. Across the room, 3 small children steadily climbed the tangled structure of the red and yellow bars. Carlton startled, looked at Marlowe with surprise, then ran to them. Are you okay? Where are your parents? He asked breathlessly. Then his mouth went dry. The children were not human, or alive. Their animatronic faces were painted like clowns, their features absurdly exaggerated. One had a round red nose that covered half its face, and a white wig of synthetic curls. Another had a molded smile on its face, and a painted red grimace. The third, a red-cheeked, smiling clown with a rainbow-colored wig, looked almost cute, except for a gigantic spring that replaced the middle of its torso, boinging up and down each time it moved. All of them had black eyes, with no iris or pupil, and they did not appear to see Carlton. He waved his hands, but they did not turn their heads, just kept grasping the bars with their pudgy hands, and pulling themselves along the structure with uncanny precision. All of them emitted a loud whirring sound, as if they were wind-up toys that had been set loose to climb. The child with the spring suddenly flung its top half over the top of the bars, the spring extending into a long wavy wire. Then it grabbed a bar, and its feet shot into the air wildly, and came snapping back into place on the other side. My mistake. You're not the kids we're looking for. Carry on, Carlton whispered shakily, as the creatures continued, weaving over and under, back and forth, through the structure. They don't see us, Marlowe whispered, and it took him a moment to register her voice. What? His eyes still on the clown children. They don't see us. These little things are working. She tapped her ear. Right, good, Carlton said, pulling himself away from the scene. Marlowe was smiling with relief. We still have to be careful, though, he warned. I can't guarantee it works on everything, and it definitely won't work on people. Marlowe shivered, then nodded quickly. There's a room past the stage, she said. Looks like an arcade, Carlton said grimly. Marlowe slowed by the stage, her hand drifting toward the curtain, as if she might try to look behind it. No, Carlton grabbed Marlowe's hand. The last thing we want to do is call any attention to ourselves. Marlowe nodded in agreement. The arcade smelled overpoweringly of new plastic. the games gleaming and scarcely played. There were a dozen or so freestanding arcade cabinets and two pinball machines, one predictably by now clown-themed, and the other painted with cartoonish snake charmers. Carlton gave them a wide berth. Mala caught his sleeve and gestured to a closed door on the wall to their left, an exit sign glowing red above it, and he nodded. They headed for it, creeping past a test your strength game, governed by an adult-sized clown with the face made of jagged metal plates, who nodded continuously, its painted smile mechanical. As they passed, Carlton watched it carefully, but its eyes did not seem to track their movements. When they reached the door, Carlton took a deep breath, then gently pushed on the bar. It gave way immediately, and Mala sighed with relief. Carlton pushed the door open, holding it out for her, then froze as the unmistakable clack of servos broke the silence behind them. They both spun around. Carlton braced his arm in front of Mala's chest, protectively, his heart racing, but nothing was moving. He scanned the room, then saw it. The clown standing over the game was staring at them, its head cocked to the side. Carlton glanced at Mala, and she nodded minutely. She had seen it too. Slowly she backed to the door as Carlton watched the animatronic, but it showed no further signs of movement. When Mala was safely through the door, Carlton waved his arms, hoping desperately that it would not see him. The clown remained motionless, having apparently returned to stasis. Carlton slipped out of the room and closed the door carefully behind him. He turned and almost fell over Mala, who was backed up almost to the wall. "Watch it," he whispered, good-naturedly, catching her shoulder for balance. Then he looked up, and swayed on his feet, disoriented by a dozen distorted, menacing figures. He took a breath, and the room fell into place. Mirrors. Before them was an array of funhouse mirrors, each one distorting the images it reflected. Carlton's eyes flitted from one to the next. One showed him and Mala as tall as the ceiling. In the next they were blown up like balloons, crowding each other out of the frame. In the next their bodies looked normal, but their heads shrank to stalks an inch wide. "Okay then," he whispered. "How do we get out of here?" As if in answer to his question, two mirrors slowly began to swivel, turning toward each other until they made a narrow door in the wall of close-set panels. Beyond the small opening lay more mirrors, but Carlton could not tell how many there were, or which way they were directed, as one mirror caught another, doubling the reflections until it was impossible to see what was real and what was not. Mala stepped through the gap and beckoned. There was a gleam in her eye, but Carlton couldn't tell if it was excitement or the strange dim light. He followed her, and as soon as he was through the gap, the panels began to pivot again, closing them inside. Carlton glanced around, growing nervous in two directions, the walls made of more floor-to-ceiling mirror panels. "It's a maze," Mala whispered, and gave him a smile when she saw the look on his face. "Don't worry," she added. "I'm good at mazes." "You're good at mazes?" Carlton said with irritation. "What is that supposed to mean?" "I'm good at mazes." "What's wrong with saying that? I've always been good with mazes." Mala shook her head. "What, like the hay maze, when we were 5? Is that what you're talking about? I got through before anyone else did. You climbed over the top of the bales. You're not supposed to do that." "Oh, you're right." Mala's face flushed. "I'm not good at mazes." "We will get through this together." Carlton took her hand long enough to stop her from having a panic attack, then released it. She looked in both directions, thoughtful, then pointed decisively. "Let's try that way," she said. They started down the path she had chosen, and Carlton followed, keeping his eyes on her feet in front of him. After only a few steps, he had a sharp intake of breath, and snapped his head up. They were at a dead end. "Dead end already?" he said, surprised. "No, the panel closed," she hissed. "This way, hay maze," Carlton said with a hint of amusement. "Back this way." They started back the way they had come, and this time Carlton saw the panels move. As they moved back to the spot where they had come in, a panel swung toward them, cutting off their path. A second later, another panel swung away, opening a new corridor. Mala hesitated, and Carlton stepped up beside her. "No choice, let's go," he said. She nodded, and they walked deeper into the maze. As soon as they had crossed the new threshold, the panel swung shut. They looked around for the new opening, but there was none. They were enclosed on all sides by mirrors. Carlton walked the small perimeter quickly, beginning to panic. "Carlton, just wait. Another one will open," Mala whispered. I know you're in here. An unfamiliar voice rang out. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing like it was bouncing from panel to panel. The sound was mechanical, glitching out mid-word. They exchanged a glance. Mala's face was pale with fear. There! Carlton pointed. A panel had opened while they were distracted. He rushed for it, and walked into a mirror, smacking his head on the glass. Ow! It's there, Mala hissed, pointing to the opposite side of the enclosure. The panel began to swing shut, closing the room off again. I'll find you. The glitching voice had a strange, unsteady tone. Carlton! Mala stood in the gap, holding out a hand, and he ran for her, both of them making it through just as the panel rotated back to its position. What were you going to do? Stand there and let it crush you? Carlton hissed. I hadn't considered we could get caught between the panels. This place is just asking for a lawsuit. Mala straightened herself. It's been a lovely evening, but I think I'd like you to take me home now, she said calmly. Take you home? Take me home, Carlton said before pausing to listen. I know just where you are. They were in a hallway again, this one with the two corners to choose from. They exchanged a grim look and turned to the left, moving slowly. Carlton kept his eyes on Mala's shoes ahead of him, trying not to look at the walls on either side, where ranks of their duplicates marched silently beside them, misshapen and warped in the mirrors, then, occasionally, appearing normal. When they reached the corner, something flashed in the corner of his eye, a reflection of giant eyes, staring at them. Carlton grabbed Mala's shoulder. Over there! She shouted. I saw it too. Come on, go, 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 go. Mala whispered. Just follow me. Stay calm. Remember, nothing can see us. I'm getting closer. The mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. It's just a recording, Carlton whispered. It's coming from everywhere. I don't think there is anything actually in here with us. Mala nodded, looking unconvinced. A few steps ahead of them, panels began to pivot again, closing off their path. Carlton glanced behind them. The other end of the hall had closed too. Mala inched closer to him. I see you. Shut up, Carlton whispered. He tried to slow his breathing so it made no sound, imagining the air going in and out, filling his lungs without touching the sides. The panel to their right began to swing open slowly, and they backed out of its way. Mala gasped, and Carlton grabbed her arm, seeing it. There was something behind the slowly opening mirror, though he couldn't make out what. They backed out farther, taking small, cautious steps. Carlton searched the mirrored panels for an exit, but saw only his own face, bulging and deformed. There you are. The panel opened, revealing a kaleidoscope of purple, white, and silver, glancing off every mirror disjointedly. Carlton blinked, trying to make sense of the reflections. Then a figure at the center stepped into the makeshift room. He was a bear, built like Freddy Fazbear, and yet entirely unlike him. His metal body was gleaming white, accented with vibrant purple. He held a microphone in his hand, the top sparkling like a disco ball, and on his chest, at the center of the purple metal shed front, was a small round speaker, only a few feet from them. The new Freddy turned his massive head from side to side, his eyes passing over them. Carlton glanced at Mala, who tapped her ear and nodded. He put his finger to his lips. Freddy took 2 steps forward, and they stepped back, pressing against the wall. Freddy looked from side to side again. I know just where you are. The sound was ear-splitting, rattling Carlton's teeth, but Freddy's mouth did not move. The voice was projecting from the speaker in his chest. Carlton held his breath as the bear's eyes passed over him, reminding himself that he was masked, but the bear's eyes hesitated on him before moving away. Carlton could feel the sweat beading on his forehead. The wall behind them repositioned, and Carlton shifted his weight just in time not to fall, Mala moving just behind him. The panel swung open slowly, and they edged away as Freddy walked slowly in that direction, heading for the new exit, where they were now standing. Mala touched Carlton's arm, guiding him to the side just as Freddy lumbered past them, his shiny surface almost brushing against Carlton's nose. I'm getting closer, Freddy stuttered menacingly as he disappeared around a corner. The panel began to swing shut, and Mala pointed urgently to the door Freddie had come in. They raced for it, making it through just before the mirrors closed. Carlton and Mala stared at each other, gasping as if they'd run miles. "Was that Freddie?" she whispered. He shook his head. "I don't know, but he was different," Carlton said. "What? Different from what?" "The other animatronics we've seen so far. He was looking at me," Carlton said uncomfortably. "They're all looking at us." "No, he was looking at me." "I can hear you. Come on out," Freddie called out as if on cue. His voice echoed through the maze of mirrors, as impossible to locate as it had been before. Carlton took a deep, steady breath. "How are we supposed to get out of here?" he whispered, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "Where even are we?" "There, that light." Mala pointed over their heads at the rafters above them, where a red stage light beamed down over the entirety of the maze. "What?" "I saw that light when we first came in, but it must have been at least 20 feet away. Now it's right over our heads. We just have to keep moving, away from it now," she said confidently. Carlton studied the ceiling for a moment, considering what she'd said. "I told you, I'm good at mazes," she winked. "We just have to wait for the right panels to open." She'd pointed toward a specific panel. "That could take ages," Carlton said despairingly. "It could take longer if we don't keep track of what direction we're going in," Mala said. "Come on." She set off down the path she had indicated, and Carlton followed close behind. "I'm getting closer," Freddie's voice resounded through the maze. That sounded like he was behind us again. "He's coming around," Carlton whispered. Okay, then we go around too." "Just get us out," he said quietly. Mala nodded, and they walked cautiously onward, flanked by their own various, distorted duplicates. The pivoting panels forced them nearly in a circle before giving them a choice of direction, and Mala leapt on the chance, grabbing Carlton by the hand and almost running down the passage until they were stopped again and made to turn. "Shh!" Carlton hissed frantically. Mala pushed experimentally on the side of one of the panels, but it didn't budge. Carlton stepped up to help, throwing his full weight against the mirror, but even under their combined force, it would not turn. "I don't know why I thought that would work," Mala whispered. "I've almost got you," Freddie intoned. Mala looked around uncertainly. "I've got a really terrible idea," Carlton said slowly. Mala gave him a warning look. "Are you still keeping track of where we are? Or at least, the direction that we should go?" "I think so," she said, scanning the rafters again, a look of comprehension dawning on her face. "Close enough," he said. "What are we going to do?" Mala asked, sounding like she already regretted it. Carlton took the flashlight out of his pocket and made a fist around it, wound up his arm, and smashed the butt of the light into the mirror in front of them. The glass shattered with a high, clear noise, and the dull pain reverberated up his arm. "I can hear you there," Freddie's voice spouted from all around them. "Does he just say that, or did he actually hear that?" Mala said. The panel with the broken mirror swung open, but before they could move, there was a rushing sound of heavy footsteps and crunching glass shards. Carlton held his breath and nodded to Mala. Freddie snapped into the room with forceful steps, then immediately stopped in the center, his upper body slowly turning to scan their surroundings. Carlton and Mala crept around the glass shards and snuck through the open panel behind the animatronic. In the corridor, Carlton looked questioningly at Mala, and she pointed. He nodded, strode to the farthest mirror, and smashed it. In an instant, Freddie pivoted toward them, the wide-eyed face turned from side to side. After a moment, another panel began to open, beyond the freshly broken mirror. Carlton and Mala ran for it, the glass breaking beneath their feet. "There!" Mala yelled. Carlton looked up and could see an exit sign above a door, just a few yards from where they stood. Mala caught Carlton's eye and mouthed, "We're almost there." "Come back here," said Freddy's maniacal voice, and then they all stepped out into the last passage. A gently painted ticket booth was visible, and beyond that, an open wall. Mala and Carlton exchanged a glance, and cautiously sped up. "Got you!" Freddy said. The speaker was right behind Carlton's head, and Carlton, startled, tripping over his own feet. He righted himself with a palm on the mirror, then took off after Mala, and ran straight into his own reflection, hitting his face on the glass. "Mala, wait!" he screamed. He could see her reflected in the 3 mirrors, but was still unsure of where she had actually gone. "Wait!" He rubbed his forehead and looked into the nearest mirror, trying to see if he was bleeding. He was not, but something was wrong. It took him a second to realize that his earpiece had been knocked loose. He looked around in panic, when suddenly Freddy loomed behind him in the mirror. Carlton froze in place. The massive white and purple bear's head was staring at him from the mirror, looming over his shoulder. He looked down and saw the earpiece at his feet. In one swift motion, he leaned down to grab it. His hands were shaking, and he struggled to get it back into his ear. When he looked up, Freddy was standing over him, and Carlton was lifted off his feet with a sudden, painful force. Carlton jerked and dropped back to the ground, the earpiece falling beside him. Freddy drew back and stared at Carlton for a moment, his eyes clicking back and forth, and his mouth opened just enough to reveal 2 long rows of perfectly polished white teeth. Carlton leapt toward the earpiece on the ground just as Freddy's arm shot out and shattered another glass panel. Carlton hit the wall head first with a bang and recoiled in pain. Freddy turned his head, first from side to side, then all the way around to face backward, his eyes searching wildly. Carlton scanned the ground in a panic and saw the earpiece again, but it was in 3 places, in 3 mirrors. The glass crunched again nearby, but Carlton kept his eyes on the earpieces, switching from one another in a desperate attempt to see which one was real. Suddenly, a human hand reached down and grabbed the earpiece in each of the 3 panels. "Carlton!" Mother called, and he turned toward the sound and saw her, not a reflection, but the real Mala, as she threw the earpiece to him. Carlton snatched the earpiece out of the air and shoved it into his ear. Freddy stopped in place, his arms still outstretched. Carlton didn't dare move, but the microphone was inches from his face. In his peripheral vision, he could see Mala inching toward a door with "exit" over it. Freddy turned his head from side to side again as he slowly straightened from his attacking posture. "I'll find you," came the voice from his chest, and he lowered his arms. Mala turned the doorknob and pushed the door slowly open, just enough to see that it was unlocked. Scarcely breathing, Carlton backed away from Freddy, keeping his eyes on the animatronic until he was beside Mala. In one fluid motion, she eased open the door. They darted through it, then shoved it close behind them. There was a deadbolt near the top, and Carlton flipped it, put his ear to the crack. There was nothing but silence from the other side, and he turned to Mala and heaved a sigh, light-headed with relief. They were in a dark hall, completely free of mirrors. "Dark, scary hallway," Mala muttered. "It's beautiful," Carlton said. A scream ripped through the air from somewhere nearby, and they both froze. "Not finished yet," Carlton said, and took off running toward the sound, Mala close at his heels. And that is the end of Chapter 12. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Five Nights at Freddy's, the The Fourth Closet. Chapter 13. Everyone, be very quiet, Jessica whispered. The children just stared at her, their eyes wide and solemn. They stood together in the back corner of the small, dank room, awaiting her instructions. 3-year-old Lisa was still huddled behind Ron, her chosen protector, and Alana had taken hold of the little blond boy's hand, though he was wriggling in her grasp. Jessica swallowed. Why do I have to be the leader? It's bad enough when I'm just in charge of myself. She bent down to the children's level, trying to summon some kind of leadership quality. Should have listened to Mom. Should have played a team sport. But no, I had to be the quiet girl in the corner chewing the eraser off a pencil. Jessica studied the door again, then took a more serious tone. Is there something out there? Alana and Ron exchanged a worried glance. What's outside? You can tell me, Jessica pleaded. It comes in through the door, Alana said, not meeting Jessica's eyes. The little girl, broke off and covered her face, mumbling something unintelligible behind the mask of her hands. Who? The woman who took you? Jessica asked gently, trying to contain her impatience. Alana shook her head vigorously, her face still hidden. We thought it was a toy. It wasn't scary like everything else. Ron searched for words, and Lisa tugged on his shirt and whispered something too quietly for Jessica to make out. Ron nudged her. Tell her. Lisa looked up at Jessica with a suspicious expression on her grubby toddler's face. She's all mangled up, the girl said, then turned away again, hiding her face in Ron's shirt. He gave Jessica a distressed look. Who's all mangled up? Jessica said slowly, searching her mind for what they might be talking about. Was something broken? Did you break one of them? She asked hopefully. The little kids all began to sniffle again, and she ground her teeth. What is it? Jessica nearly snapped, but none of them seemed to notice her tone. It's not broken, Ron said, his voice rising in panic, and then the floor shook with a resounding thud. Alana grabbed Jessica around the waist, and Ron huddled closer, pulling Lisa with him. The little blond boy stayed where he was, frozen in place with a look of terror. There was another thud, this time louder. Then the pounding continued, over and over, coming closer. Jessica could hear it moving in the hall, reverberating deep in her chest, as whatever it was came thundering toward the door outside. She heard wood cracking, and clutched the children's shoulders as something struck the wall 3 times in quick succession, rocking them all back. There was a final clattering noise that seemed to come from all around. What is that? Jessica whispered, searching the walls and ceiling, unable to make sense of the noises. Then everything fell silent. They waited. Jessica listened, counting to 10, then 20, and the sound did not come again. She counted to 30, then 60. I have to do something. She straightened, carefully extracting herself from Alana's grasp. Wait here, she whispered. She crept toward the door, stepping as softly as she could. As she moved, she could feel their eyes on her. The door was ordinary looking, a wooden door with a brass knob, the kind you'd see on a closet. Jessica took a quick, deep breath, then stretched out her arm to take the knob. Before she could touch it, the knob turned, and the door began to slide open. Jessica held her breath and took steady steps backward, desperately wanting to rejoin the group, even if they were just children. At first, Jessica saw only pink and white, the shapes indistinct. Then her mind made sense of it. Slowly, the enormous head of a garishly painted fox peered into the room. Foxy? Jessica thought, hazily taking in pointed pink ears and yellow eyes. Its cheeks were painted with red circles, like the animatronic girl's had been. The creature looked at her for a long moment, and she stared back, unable to remember how to move her feet. And then the fox head retreated, and all the children screamed. Something new sprang violently into the room, a long and segmented metal limb like a spider's leg. It braced against the floor just as a second metal leg violently invaded the space, embedding itself in the nearest wall. The children screamed, and Jessica raced toward them, looking frantically for a way out. The room was filling with arms and legs, extended and contorted, some with hands,
others without. Jessica searched for a place to run through the steadily thickening mass of legs. Her eyes met the yellow eyes of the fox head, now suspended in the air by rods and beams. But there was another set of eyes as well. Does it have two heads? The unskinned metal skull lowered itself. It was connected to the mass above by cables and cords, and seemed to move of its own will. One high-pitched scream rose above the others, a blood-curdling wail. "Lisa!" Ron cried, and Jessica saw that the thing had one hand on the little girl's arm, and was pulling her toward it. The skinless metal hand studied her, then swiveled and swung on its cables to the others, taking an aggressive stance toward them as the metal limbs entangled the little girl and pulled her toward the door. "No!" Jessica cried, climbing through the snares of metal coils and grabbing Lisa's tiny hand. The violent surge threw her back, but she held fast to whatever she had managed to grasp, letting go only as she hit the floor. She struggled for air as she got to her feet, but the creature had already retreated through the doorway and disappeared. Jessica whirled, looking frantically to the children, and her heart nearly burst with relief. Lisa was on the ground beside her, and Ron and Alana were helping her up. Jessica rushed to them. "It's okay," she whispered. Then the momentary relief vanished. The blond boy, the one who might have been Jacob, was gone. "I couldn't hold on to him," Alana wailed, as if reading Jessica's mind. Jessica looked to the door in despair, but quickly steadied herself. "We'll get him back," Jessica said, because it was all she could think of to say. She glanced around helplessly, then froze as the doorknob slowly began to turn again. "Stay here," Jessica said in a low voice, and she moved quickly to the door. She stood to the side, bracing herself to jump on whatever came through. "This is your plan?" The door opened, and Jessica screamed and lunged into the doorway, as though ready to karate chop whatever was coming through. Carlton and Mala jumped back with startled expressions, and Jessica stared for a moment, then seized Carlton in a hug, holding tight to his shoulders, as if he could stop her from shaking. "Jessica," Mala said, spotting the children. Jessica pushed Carlton away. "Something got one of the kids. A little boy," she said in a rush. "I didn't see where it went." Mala was already beside the children, checking them for injury. "We have to get them out," she said. "Oh, really, Mala? Is that what we should be doing?" "Here I was, painting my nails," Jessica said crisply. Carlton reached for his ear and pulled something out. "Here, take this," he said. "What? Ew!" Jessica made a face instinctively, then peered at the tiny device. "Is that a hearing aid?" "Not exactly. It makes you invisible to the animatronics. You and Mala take these kids out. I'll find the other kid they took." "How does it—" Jessica took the device and studied it. "I have to put it in my ear?" "Yes, you have to put it in your ear. I'll explain later. But are your ears even clean?" She leaned in, peering suspiciously at Carlton's ear. Mala grabbed the earpiece out of her hand and shoved it into Jessica's ear. "Ow!" Jessica cried. Mala turned back to the kids. "Shouldn't we give them to the children instead? There are only two earpieces, and you can both protect them better if you're invisible, right?" Carlton said irritably. "What if Jess and I stay here with the kids, and you take out one at a time, wearing the earpieces?" Mala pressed. Jessica shook her head immediately. "And what if that thing comes back and kills us all while we're waiting for Carlton to take his sweet time? We have to make a break for it. Mala, it's the only way." They were all quiet for a moment. Carlton looked from Jessica to Mala and back. "Right? Now, give me 30 seconds to get away from here. That way, if something chases me, I can draw them away from you. Anything I should know?" Carlton paused at the door. "Afton's still alive," Jessica said, and he nodded. "This ends today," he said quietly. "One way or another, not one more child dies because of that psychopath. I owe that much to Michael." Jessica bit her lip. "We all do," she said. He forced a smile. "Good luck," she echoed. "Right." Carlton clenched his jaw, then squared his shoulders and held the door open, poised to exit. "This was my idea," he muttered, then closed the door behind him. "Mala, do you know the way out?" Jessica asked, surprised to hear her own voice come out clear and steady. Mala nodded, standing up. "We came in the back way, but I think if we go back down that hall, we can get out into the main dining room. Should be easy to get out from there, right? You think so, Jessica muttered with an edge. Mala gave her a level look. You got something better? No, I don't. Jessica turned to the three remaining children, who were watching them with wide eyes. We don't have to get far, she said, searching for scraps of hope to offer them. I need you to stay together, and stay with me and Mala. If you can do that, we'll all be okay. They looked at her, like they knew she was lying, but no one said a word. Jessica opened the door again carefully. The hallway outside the little room was dark, but Mala led them outward, as if she really did know where they were headed. She held a large, battered flashlight out in front of her. She looked poised to turn it on, but refrained from doing so, seemingly afraid of attracting more unwanted attention. Jessica's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she took up the rear, alert to the slightest sign of danger. They came to a T in the hole, and Mala turned without hesitation. A few yards ahead there was light. Strings of small, bare bulbs lit the way at intervals, and the next fork in the hole was visible. We're getting closer, Jessica thought, as they moved cautiously onward. A soft popping noise caught Jessica's attention overhead, and she froze. Mala! She hissed, and Mala and the children ahead stopped and turned around. Mala pointed up with a worried expression, and Jessica looked up to see that some of the bulbs over her head had gone out, the glass made opaque with a sooty film. Just old lights, Jessica breathed. A light above Mala burst and died, and all of them jumped. Alana clapped both hands over her mouth, and Ron put a hand on Lisa's shoulder. Can we go faster? Lisa whispered. All at once, the rest of the light bulbs flickered and clattered. Jessica held her breath. They stayed on, preserving the little light, but overhead something hollow and metallic rattled in the ceiling. Mala's face went pale. Keep moving, she said tightly. Jessica gave a sharp nod. The rattling noise kept pace, sometimes seeming to come from above them, and sometimes from the dark corners just out of view, scraping and clattering in a vent or crawl space. Lisa whimpered. The older children's faces were stony, but Jessica could see the glimmer of tears on their cheeks. Suddenly, Mala stopped short, and Jessica almost bumped into Ron. What? She hissed, then saw. A thin curtain of dust was falling from above. Jessica looked up and saw the open duct directly above them. A multi-segmented metal arm covered with springs and wires dropped down through the open duct, anchoring itself to the floor right next to Jessica's foot. Everyone screamed. The arm retracted, then two more of the creature's contorted limbs smashed down to the ground, raining down plaster and dust. Run! Mala screamed. They took off down the hallway as the creature lowered its full form into the space, its shiny white fox head turning and smiling in their direction as they fled. Jessica glanced back, and the unskinned head dropped too, grinning upside down, a red bow tie joining their necks ridiculously. Jessica fled. Behind her came an enormous thud. Run faster! She wanted to scream, but the others were gasping for breath, already running at their full capacity. The children were pounding along as fast as they could, but Lisa, the smallest, began to fall behind. The creature shot past Jessica, reaching out for the little girl again, and Jessica grabbed her, yanking her up and out of reach just in time. It reared back to strike again, and Jessica clutched Lisa to her chest and ran on. They rounded a corner, and with a flare of hope, Jessica saw that the hall was short, ending in a heavy set of double doors. Mala sped up, and Alana and Ron did the same. Jessica kept her pace, staying at the back as Lisa clung to her with startling strength. Mala reached the end of the hall and slammed herself against the emergency bar, and the doors split open. They raced through, and Mala flung the door shut, grabbing a nearby signpost and jamming it through the door handles. Keep running, Jessica said with a fresh pump of adrenaline. She looked around. They were up against the wall, behind a popcorn popper and cotton candy machine. She glanced back briefly at the sign Mala had barred the door with. "Let's eat," it read, in big, round letters. Ron leaned to the side, about to peek between the machines. "Hold on," she hissed, putting a hand on his shoulder. He drew back, as if something had banned them. "It'll be okay," Mala said, and Jessica marveled briefly that she sounded like she believed what she was saying. Behind them, something crashed against the door again, rattling the doorframe. Jessica waited, her eyes on the makeshift barricade, but nothing came. "We have to move slowly and quietly," she whispered, and the three children nodded in unison. "Stay back," Jessica told them, and stepped out past the popcorn machine, alert to danger. She took a second to get her bearings. The walls of the dining room were lined with arcade games and children's play areas, and on the far side of the room, blissfully, were the wide glass doors of the entrance. She motioned the others forward. The children, huddled together, followed her into the open room, with Mala close behind. "Hurry!" she urged, and Mala nodded, taking Lisa's hand as Alana and Ron followed behind her, their faces pinched with exhaustion. Suddenly, Alana screamed, and Jessica jumped. "What? What is it?" The girl was pointing at a jungle gym a few feet away, where two toddlers, too small to climb the bars, were nonetheless doing so. "It's okay. They're just toys," Mala said, looking back at Jessica with a frazzled expression. "We saw them on the way in." Alana screamed again and ran to Jessica, grabbing onto her waist. "It bit me!" "What?" Jessica looked down. Alana's ankle was bleeding, though not badly, and a few feet away was another crawling robotic child. "Jessica!" Mala screamed, touching the device in her ear nervously. "It can't see us, but it can see them." As she spoke, the two other robotic children on the monkey bars lowered themselves unsteadily to the ground and began to crawl straight toward Lisa and Ron. They backed away, and a fourth appeared, boxing them in. Mala scooped up Lisa and Alana and tried to hold them away from harm. "Jessica!" Mala screamed. "Help! It bit me!" Alana repeated, panic in her voice, and the children clung together as the crawlers came closer, a slow march of determined toddlers with the black eyes of insects. "They can't see us," Jessica said with determination, darting forward and grabbing the nearest robot baby. It was heavier than it looked. Jessica held it out from her body. It was facing away from her, and she held on tight as it continued its crawling movements in the air, steadily putting its hands and feet into position. She glanced around, then spotted the ball pit, at least 4 or 5 feet deep. Jessica threw the crawler down into the colorful balls as hard as she could, and it landed, half buried on its side, still repeating its motions, and slowly sank out of sight. "Mala, come on!" Mala set down Lisa and Alana beside Ron, then turned her attention to the baby crawling toward them. Her hands were shaking like she was preparing to pick up a giant cockroach. "Mala!" Jessica shrieked. Mala screamed and shook her hands in the air, and the baby suddenly charged forward, clawing at the ground and biting at the children's feet. Lisa cried and fell to the ground, and the heavy creature grabbed at her legs as it crawled up on top of her. Mala bolted forward with a blood-curdling scream and yanked the metal crawler off the little girl. Mala cried out again as she spun and threw the creature through the air. It missed Jessica's head by an inch, slammed into the net canopy above the ball pit, and dropped down into it, sinking out of sight. "You almost hit me!" Jessica had barely spoken the words when the third and final robot baby flew through the air and landed at her feet with a resounding bang. Mala let herself fall to the ground, breathing heavily, her eyes wide with panicked fury. Jessica stared down at the creature as it locked its sights on the children again. Mala let herself fall to the ground, breathing heavily, her eyes wide with panicked fury. Jessica stared down at the creature as it locked its sights on the children again. "Oh, no you don't." Jessica picked it up just as it started to crawl. She held it over the pit and turned its head around completely to face her with its ant-like eyes. Its little rosebud mouth opened, flashing 2 rows of pointy predator's teeth, then snapped shut. chomping the air. Jessica shuddered and dropped it, watching with grim fascination as it chained its arms and legs, digging itself deeper into the pit. "Jessica!" Marla cried, and she spun around. Lights had come on behind them, illuminating a large show stage with a bright purple curtain as its backdrop. On the stage, and in the spotlight, was a glossy and white Foxy animatronic, its mouth open and arms wide, ready to perform for a cheering crowd. The Fox looked down at them with delight. "Was that there a second ago?" Jessica whispered. Suddenly, the Fox's body began cracking apart. Metal plates split away from the center of its torso, from its arms and legs, lifting out, splitting again, and folding back, leaving only its canine head untouched, grinning maniacally as its body was horribly transformed. Jessica ran to the children as all at once tentacle-like metal limbs erupted from what had been Foxy, and the mutilated skeleton creature stretched out into its new, semi-arachnid form. "Get them out!" Jessica cried. Alana and Ron were frozen to the spot, staring, and Marla slapped their cheeks. Ron snatched up Lisa's hand, and together they all ran for the front door. "Jessica!" Marla cried as they reached the door. "We can't let it get out!" The creature was on top of the monkey bars now, elongating itself to terrifying proportions, as if showing off its tangled metal spines. "Get them out!" Jessica shouted again, pushing away from them, then turning her attention back to the mangled pink and white fox. The thing began to slowly dismount the monkey bars, its limbs slipping over and around one another, changing its shape with every step it took. Its fox-like face and its vaguely human one were both intent on the children, the heads angled slightly toward each other so that each of its eyes could focus. Jessica took a deep breath, then pulled the earpiece out of her ear, struggling to steady her hands long enough to slip it into her pocket. "Over here!" she screamed as loudly as she could, her throat going raw, and the canine head ducked under the other neck, its eye rolling around to fix on her. "Yeah, over here!" Jessica cried, her voice hoarse, and the thing came down from the monkey bars with menacing grace and began to slink toward her. She glanced around, should have thought this through. At the door, she could see Marla bracing it open and shooing the children through, one at a time, then looking back to Jessica. Jessica nodded her head and waved Marla away. She grabbed a folding chair from a nearby table and hefted it over her head, then flung it at the creature. It landed with a clatter on the floor, missing the thing entirely. The fox head cocked to the side, its mouth hanging open to show all of its teeth. Then it lurched forward, its metal appendages banging against the ground. Jessica turned and ran. She looked around wildly for an escape as she darted through the mass of tables at the center of the room. She shoved over a table behind her, but the thing just climbed over it like it was flat ground. Jessica sped up. The creature was right behind her, the fox head snapping its jaws as the unskinned skull grinned ghoulishly from its swing. She raced back the way they had come, ducking between the cotton candy machine and the popcorn cart. The sign blocking the doors was still in place, and she flung it away and yanked the door handle. It rattled in place, but still wouldn't open. Something crashed behind her, and Jessica spun around to see the popcorn cart knocked over, popcorn strewn across the black and white floor tiles. The creature stretched out a limb and pushed the cotton candy machine experimentally. It rocked, but did not fall. Then another limb shot out. It hit Jessica's leg with a smack, and she stumbled back against the door, an involuntary shout of pain blurting from her mouth. The fox and the unskinned head looked at each other, the head bouncing on its cables. Then in unison they turned their eyes on her as the creature undulated its limbs, displaying their full extension. Jessica felt in her pocket for the earpiece, but couldn't find it. It must have fallen out while she was running. She darted her eyes from side to side, afraid to move even her head. She was cornered, caught between the wall and the children's climbing set. There was no way past the thing. All at once, the creature seized the cotton candy machine with 3 of its limbs, crushing it. Shattering glass sprayed in all directions as it carelessly flung the machine aside. Jessica shielded her face, turning away, and as the machine cracked the floor tiles behind her, she saw it, the red and yellow bars of the playset nearby led high above the room below, where a colorful pipe maze began, bolted right to the ceiling, and disappearing into a circular hole in the wall and into the next room. That's my way out. Jessica set her foot on the bottom rung of the playset and started to climb as fast as she could. Below her came a wrenching noise, and she glanced down to see the creature tearing up the playset, the unskinned head swinging and bobbing gleefully. It reached up and tore out the rung below her, and she climbed faster, hurling her upper body into the tube just as one of the creature's hands grasped the last piece of the playset. Jessica scrabbled for a handhold, at last managing to pull her full body inside the tube. She crawled as fast as she could, the pipe shaking with every movement, then stopped to look down. Although some of the plastic tunnel was bolted to the ceiling, there were large portions that were not. This was made for kids, not me. Jessica rocked herself carefully, and the section of plastic below her rocked as well, the plastic segments creaking at the seams. Jessica shivered, slow and steady. She checked her hands and knees, making sure they were safely in place, then started forward again. She was in a narrow, unadorned tube, hovering above an empty hallway, lit by a single exposed fluorescent light that hummed as it flickered. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder as she made her way cautiously along the fragile plastic flooring, filling her ears almost painfully, as if she had gone deep underground. She worked her jaw open and shut, trying to clear the sensation, but the noise persisted. When she reached the segment of tubing that went into the wall above the door, she hesitated, trying to see inside, but there was only darkness. Jessica took a deep breath and carefully crossed into the next room. Silence fell. The humming noise was blissfully gone. The only light was behind her, and bizarrely, it did not penetrate into the room, as if it were somehow being filtered out. She looked back and saw the circle of light where she had come, but everything else was in darkness. Jessica blinked, waiting for her eyes to adjust, but all she saw was black. Okay then. She shuffled slowly forward, feeling carefully and sliding her knees along the support beams that ran along sections of the tunnel. After a few minutes, she came to a turn, bumping her head gently on the plastic, and she felt her way around it with a vague sense of accomplishment. A point of orange light appeared below her, and she startled, her hand slipping off the support beam and rattling the plastic. She caught her balance, her heart racing, and a pair of green lights appeared, a few feet away from the first one. They vanished, then reappeared, and another pair, purple, sprang out of the darkness beside them. And this time Jessica saw the dark pinpoint at the center of each circle. Jessica tensed with an awful recognition as more and more sets of colored lights appeared. Eyes. Their eyes. The room below was slowly filling with sets of eyes, until it seemed impossible that so many creatures could fit into the space. They all stared upward, unblinking, at Jessica. She moved slowly forward, her hands shaking as they found their way along the beams, and the eyes followed her as she went. Don't look down. Jessica set her gaze on the darkness in front of her, and shuffled on and on for what felt like ages. Each time she glanced down, there were more pairs and pairs of watchful eyes, all of them rapt on her progress. Jessica shivered. She moved faster, still feeling carefully before she slid her hands and knees along. Then the tube curved slightly, and a circle of dim light came into view. Jessica crawled for it as fast as she dared, the tube swaying precariously as she moved. She crawled through the hole and turned back. The room was in darkness again. All the eyes had vanished. Jessica shuddered, revolted, then looked down at the room she now hovered above. The light was dim and unsteady, flashing strange colors at intervals, but she could see clearly. Peering down, Jessica saw that it was coming from the carnival games that filled the room, some flickering noiselessly, and others giving the steady light in every hue. She took a deep breath and looked ahead, trying to see where the tube led. I really hope there's another way out, she thought, and started crawling again. The plastic tubing rattled as she went, the only noise in the dark room. Jessica swallowed. As the adrenaline waned, She was beginning to remember how much she hated enclosed spaces. Just keep moving. She reached a split in the tubing. One way snaked around the perimeter of the room, and the other through another wall, into the pipe maze bolted to the ceiling of the next room. She scanned the room, then made her choice. She took the turn, taking the tunnel that fed through the neatly cut hole in the wall, and found herself back in the main dining room. She paused and listened. There was no sound of movement in the dining room, and she craned her neck to look down through one of the large plastic panes, searching the area. The creature was nowhere to be seen. She had not noticed the play pipes that covered the ceiling before climbing up into them, but now she saw the extent of them, with no end in sight and no way down. The place that she had climbed to enter the tunnels was utterly destroyed. How am I going to get out? She cast her eyes helplessly over the maze, tracing the paths she could take, and suddenly she saw it. The ball pit where she had thrown the baby crawlers was across the room, and it had a canopy made of climbing rope that stretched 15 or 20 feet above the floor. The tube went directly over it. Jessica took a deep breath and crawled farther out into the room, bracing herself. She made it to the first turning point, and suddenly the pipe shook. She paused, but the structure shook again and again. The light was being obscured from below her, and Jessica looked down. The unskinned skull grinned up at her with yellow eyes, suspended below as if out of nowhere. The head swiveled sideways and elevated up and over the plastic tunnel. Jessica looked up in dread and saw the body of the creature right above her, its limbs wrapped around the tube like a monstrous squid seizing a ship. She stifled a scream, and her heart skipped as she fought not to hyperventilate. The fox's head lowered to eye level and snapped beside her, and she screamed and shied away. Her hand hit the plastic floor between the support beams, and the segment fell straight down. Jessica clambered back before falling with it, and quickly took a corner, heading off to a new direction. The fox head swooped upward in a blur and vanished. Jessica crawled in a straight line, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. The structure continued to shake, and she could hear plastic breaking behind her, as well as large segments of the pipe maze crashing to the ground. Soon she reached the ball pit, and she stared down at the canopy of ropes through the bottom of the tube, hesitating. Now what? The structure shook again, but this time it was different. This time it trembled as though someone or something were in the maze with her. The entirety of the structure swayed and rocked on the bolts it hung from. Jessica kicked out the plastic below her, bracing herself on the side of the tube as she looked down. Something moved in the pit below. 3 of the crawlers' heads were above the surface, staring up at her disembodied with blank eyes. In unison, they snapped their little jaws, and she startled, hitting her head on the top of the plastic tube. "Stupid babies," she muttered. When she looked down again, they were back in motion, swimming through the balls and snapping apparently at random. Jessica shivered and froze, suddenly paralyzed at the next step of her plan. For a moment she prayed that it wasn't too late to just stay silent and wait for danger to pass. The structure trembled again, this time over and over in rapid succession. A spiral of shimmering metal flew through the tunnel. Then she saw its gleaming fox's head, its mouth open in an impossible smile. Jessica screamed and fell sideways through the hole, landing heavily on the rope canopy. It sank inward, giving her a split second before she began to slip downward. She grabbed wildly at the net, the ropes bending her hands and entangling her feet. Then she got her footing and scrambled back up the slope to the top, wrapping her hands around the metal support bar. She watched the hole in the bottom of the pipe that she had fallen through, expecting something to come out, but nothing did. There was motion in the pipes, barely visible through the thick, foggy plastic. Jessica searched in panic, trying to locate the creature, but there was movement everywhere. Every pipe seemed to be crawling with life. Then she realized all the movement was flowing in the same direction. Jessica followed the flow with her eyes, through pipe after pipe, all the way up to a plastic end cap just above her. With a crash, the end cap burst out of place, and bolts rained down from the sky, hitting Jessica on the head. The fox head beamed down at her. More of its body pushed its way through, more and more limbs emerging as it balanced itself delicately on the edge of the pipe like a cat preparing to pounce on a mouse. Something fell out of Jessica's pocket with a ding. It was the earpiece, which must have been wedged into her other pocket. Jessica held steady, violently fumbling to retrieve the earpiece. The fox head craned sideways as the last piece of the monster exited the pipe and joined the rest of the metal mass, perched like a vulture on the rickety infrastructure of the pipes. Finally, the fox lunged. Jessica crammed the earpiece into her ear and jumped, and the creature slammed into the netting where she had been, its limbs shooting through the spaces in the net. Jessica landed on her back on the top of an arcade cabinet, then fell to the floor below with a thud. The wind knocked out of her, and she wheezed. The creature struggled to free itself from the net. The limbs writhed, then the whole body sank down with the net, tearing it off the frame as it went. The creature was stuck, its limbs tangled in the mesh. It thrashed and flailed, and its long, snake-like appendages lashed through the air. The net rocked back and forth, straining in its bonds, then gave way in an instant. The thing dropped straight down into the pit, sending colorful plastic balls splashing over the sides of the pit. It twisted frantically, still tangled in the torn netting. Then suddenly it began to twitch. Jessica watched, wide-eyed, as the bound creature slowly sank into the ball pit, with a sound like metal grinding metal. After a moment it vanished entirely, though the balls boiled up frenziedly as the gnashing sound continued. Briefly she caught a glimpse of a black-eyed crawler, chewing contentedly. She drew in a shaky breath, then ran for the front entrance. Jessica burst out through the double door and into the cool night air, and swayed on her feet. "Are you all right?" Mala asked with alarm. "I'm fine." Jessica looked at each of the children, confirming that they were all there, all safe, except one. "Carlton. Do you have him?" She forced herself to smile. "So, who wants to visit a police station?" Carlton crept quickly down the hall, scanning the walls and floor for signs of struggle, of anything that would indicate something had passed through. There was another door a little way down the hall, and he paused outside it, carefully turning the knob while staying outside the frame. Bracing himself, he pushed the door in and waited. Nothing came out, and he cautiously peered inside. The room was completely empty. Calm before the storm, he whispered to himself, and shut the door. When he reached the T in the hall, he paused. "Where are you, kid?" He closed his eyes, listening. There was nothing, and then a muffled scraping came from the wall behind him, back the way he and Mala had come. Carlton went toward it, and put his ear to the wall. The rustling continued. It was an odd sound he could not quite pinpoint, but it sounded like someone moving. He stepped back, examining the wall. It was plain, painted beige, with a large silver air vent near the baseboard, about 3 feet high and almost as wide. "That's strange." Carlton knelt down in front of the vent and turned on his flashlight, which worked, somewhat impressively, after its extended use as a blunt instrument. He turned the beam on the vent and squinted, trying to see inside, but the slats were too close together to make out anything. A faint sound came from somewhere deep inside. It was indistinct, but it was unmistakably a voice. Carlton tugged at the grate with his fingernails, and it moved easily. He pulled the whole thing out, revealing a dark tunnel about 4 feet high. He shone his flashlight inside. The walls were concrete, painted red on one side and blue on the other in faded colors. Incomprehensible words were scribbled on them in crayon, and the yellow linoleum floor was scuffed with black sneaker marks, scratched, and turning up at the edges. "This place is brand new, right?" Carlton muttered as he crouched down and crawled inside, keeping the light ahead of him. It was unsettling to think of someone carefully laying down a new floor, then marking it with deliberate signs of wear, adult hands mimicking children's painstaking handwriting and simple drawings. He cast the light around. On the red wall there was a drawing of a house and stick figures, Underneath, someone had written, "My house," with the E drawn backward. The sound of the voice came again, echoing faintly through the tunnel ahead, and Carlton crawled forward, awkwardly, with the flashlight in one hand. The wall color changed every few feet, cycling through the rainbow at random, with childlike graffiti spaced unevenly all along the way. He came to what he thought was an opening to a new tunnel, but when he turned the light toward it, he saw that it was only a cubbyhole, small enough for a child to squeeze into. In the corner of it was a little blue sneaker, the laces untied, and Carlton swallowed. What is this place? His flashlight lit on a silently screaming face, and Carlton jumped back, dropping the light. He snatched it up again, his heart thumping, and shone it on the figure. It was a jack-in-the-box stuck in its surprise position, a white-faced clown, its mouth gaping in perpetual laughter. "This isn't a vent," Carlton whispered, letting the light leave the painted face and continue down the colorful hall littered with hiding spaces and scuff marks. "This is part of the play area." The light fixed on a rainbow stretching above one of the hiding spaces. "Hide and seek hallway," it read. "This can't be good." Carlton winced. The child's voice echoed again, this time a little louder, and he shook off the eerie sensation. "I'm coming, kid," he promised silently. He rounded a corner, but stopped short. There was an animatronic baby in a cubbyhole, motionless, laying on its back. Carlton's elbows and knees trembled. "Please don't move." Black, insect-like eyes stared blankly at him from a sweet plastic face. The crawler did not move, apparently deactivated. He backed away cautiously and turned his light on the path ahead. He was approaching a turn, but there was still no sign of an exit. He crawled on, passing stick figures and houses that were beginning to look suspiciously repetitive. "I see you," Carlton whirled around. There was nothing in sight but a closed door. It was the size of the other cubbyholes, child height, with a small heart-shaped window near the top. As he passed his light over the little door, something glinted through the heart-shaped window. Carlton stiffened, but before he could think to move, the door broke off its hinges as Freddie crawled forcefully out, a maniacal grin on his shiny purple and white face, as he unfolded from the cramped space he had stepped himself into. Carlton crawled backward frantically, and Freddie matched his motions, keeping a distance of inches between them. Carlton glanced around, then turned and crawled as fast as he could down the tunnel, his knees and hands slamming into the floor painfully as he raced to get away. He glanced back. Freddie was crawling behind him, his mechanical arms and legs thundering faster than Carlton could hope to escape. He rounded a corner, and Freddie caught his foot, the iron fingers digging into his heel. Carlton kicked with his other foot, wrestling himself free, and got to his feet, and started to run, hunched down to half his height and scraping the ceiling with his back. From behind he could hear the sound of Freddie bearing down on him, his hands and knees pounding the floor with vibrating force. Carlton turned another corner, and relief surged through him. There was a vent along the tunnel, an actual vent that led to a large room. Carlton kicked it out without hesitation, and scurried through to the room on the other side. The room was enormous, seemingly designed to house a single giant carnival ride. It was a ring of seats set on an angle, held together by huge metal arms on a spiral, a terrifying variation on the merry-go-round that would whip around at high speed while tilting nauseatingly up and down. On the far side of it was a door marked "Exit." Before Carlton could run for the door, Freddie burst out of the tunnel, climbing to his feet, his eyes sickeningly reflective in the dark. "I see you so clearly now," said the speaker in Freddie's chest. Carlton turned to run, then smacked into the carnival ride, biting his lip and drawing blood. He turned back just in time to see Freddie lunge at him, and Carlton ducked under the ride, the blow just missing him and hitting the metal side of the tilted merry-go-round. The sound rang out in the vast, empty room, and he shuddered, then leapt back as another blow hit the ride above him, reverberating so hard it rattled his teeth. Carlton looked up. The metal had bowed out above his head, caving to Freddy's strength. You can't escape. Carlton scrambled away, tripping over the heavy steel beams that undergirded the ride, bolting into the ground. Freddy's shiny purple and white calves stalked him calmly, keeping pace with him along the perimeter of the ride as Carlton ducked under heavy cables and mysterious, frightening-looking gears. "I've almost got you," Freddy announced. "Not yet," Carlton muttered as he carefully untangled his foot from the heavy wire that had ensnared him. He craned his neck, trying to see the room around him. There was no way he could get past Freddy, and even if he did, he would pursue him relentlessly. Carlton was backed up against the tilted end of the ride and up against the control platform. As he craned his head upward, he could see a large on-off lever, which was almost in reach. Nowhere else to run. Carlton waited for Freddy to make his way deeper under the ride, pressing and contorting his body to get at Carlton between the beams. Carlton squeezed out from under the ride and hoisted himself just high enough to pull the lever and activate the ride, then dropped to the ground and covered his head. Freddy reached for him, but the ride tilted abruptly. Carlton saw Freddy jerk about, wrenched by the moving parts, until the ride jolted hard. Carlton clutched his head as his ears rang with the impact, a growing shriek of tearing metal and grating gears as the ride slowed, wobbling unsteadily on its axis. Carlton didn't move. From where he had landed, he could see the apparatus in motion, shredding through the body of what had been Freddy. As the machine ground on inexorably through its routine, scraps of purple appeared and vanished, then fell to the floor, spat out by the machine. A yellow eyeball appeared in a space between two gears, and Carlton watched with shocked fascination as the rest of the precariously balanced body was pulverized by the alternating beams, then dropped to the ground in several distinct masses. The machine screeched ear-splittingly, then slowed and sputtered to a dead stop. Carlton didn't move for a moment. He got to his feet and cautiously moved away from the apparatus, carefully avoiding the littered scraps of metal and plastic on the ground. He didn't dare climb under the thing again, but he prodded it gently with his toe, then yanked his foot back as something dropped out. Half of Freddy's head, one-eyed and still grinning insanely, fell out of the machine near Carlton, spun partially on the ground, then stopped moving, and its single eye flickered on, then sputtered and died. The speaker and the now smashed chest piece, laying armless and legless nearby, crackled with static, then spoke. "Thanks for playing! Come again soon!" The voice trailed away and went silent. In the distance, the child's scream came again, and Carlton was startled back to himself. "Hang on, kid," he whispered, and headed grimly for the door. And that is the end of chapter 13. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Five Nights at Freddy's, the fourth.
Five Nights at Freddy's, the Fourth Closet. Chapter 14. Charlie's duplicate stared back at her, looking stunned for an instant. Then Charlie watched her own face curve into a bright, cruel smile. The other Charlie didn't move, and Charlie's fear receded as she watched this strange imitation of herself, astonished. "That's my face." Charlie reached up and touched her own cheek, and the other girl imitated her. Charlie tilted her head to the side, and the girl mirrored her movement. Charlie could not tell if she was being mocked, or if the other girl was simply as entranced as she was. The duplicate was a little taller than Charlie, and Charlie flicked her eyes to the girl's feet. Her black combat boots had heels. She was wearing a red V-neck shirt and a short black skirt, and her hair was long and hung in shiny waves, a look Charlie had given up even attempting halfway through 9th grade. She looked polished, confident in her stance. She looked the way Charlie wished she could be, some version of herself that had figured out curling irons and sophistication, and taking up space in the world without apology. "What are you?" Charlie whispered, mesmerized. "Come on," the other Charlie said, holding out her hand, and Charlie started to reach out to her, then stopped herself, yanking her hand away. She shrank away, stumbling back across the hall, and her duplicate closed the distance between them, leaning in so close, Charlie should have felt her breathing. A long moment passed, but the other Charlie did not draw breath. "You need to come with me," she said. "Father wants us to come home." Charlie startled at the phrase. "My father is dead," she said. She pressed back against the wall, as far from the girl's face as she could get. "Well, would you like to have a live one?" the other Charlie asked, with a mocking edge. "There is nothing that you can give me, and certainly not that," Charlie said shakily, inching backward into the storage room. The duplicate followed her step for step. Charlie glanced past the duplicate and into the open bedroom door. John emerged into the hallway, leaning heavily on the doorframe and gripping his side. "Are you okay, Charlie?" he asked in a low, steady voice. "Oh, I'm just fine, John," Charlie's duplicate said cheerfully. "Charlie," John repeated, ignoring her. Charlie nodded, not daring to take her eyes off the impostor. "She says father wants us to come home," Charlie said. John stepped up behind the other Charlie. "Father? Would that be William Afton?" John demanded. He took a few sprinted steps and grabbed a lamp by its base, raising it for attack. The other Charlie smiled again, then swiftly raised her arm and backhanded John across the face. He dropped the lamp and staggered backward, catching himself against the wall, and the duplicate grabbed for Charlie's hand. Charlie ducked away, running for the hallway, with the girl on her heels. "Hey! That was just round one!" John shouted, beckoning his assailant to come back. He grabbed the duplicate girl's arm, yanking her back toward him and away from where Charlie had run. The duplicate allowed John to hold her close, not resisting. John was washed with fear as he stood eye to eye with the impostor. "Now what do I do?" "Just like by the old oak tree, when we were little, John," the duplicate whispered. She pulled him close and pressed her lips against his. His eyes widened, and he tried to push her away, but he could not move. When she finally released him and pulled back, she was Charlie, his Charlie, and there was a high, painful ringing in his ears. He covered his ears, but the ringing increased exponentially, and for a few brief seconds before he collapsed to the ground, he saw her face morph into 1,000 things. The room spun, and his head hit the ground with a crack. The girl smiled and glanced at Charlie, then drew back her foot and kicked John in the ribs, knocking him onto his side and against a heavy wooden trunk. Charlie ran toward him, but before she could reach him, the girl grabbed her hair, bringing tears to her eyes. The impostor pulled upward, lifting Charlie several inches off the ground, and then flung her aside. Charlie tried to regain her footing, but tripped backward over a cardboard box and slammed hard into the opposite wall, knocking the wind out of her as John got wearily to his feet. Charlie climbed to her knees. She dragged in heavy, grinding breaths, watching helplessly as the other Charlie strode toward John. He straightened, and without a pause, she punched him in the stomach. He doubled over, and before he could stand, she hit the back of his head with a fist, like it was a hammer and he was a nail. John fell forward, catching himself on his hands and knees, and scrambled up. He lunged again at the girl, catching her shoulder with his fist, but the blow glanced off her, and he yelped in pain, clutching his hand like it had hit something harder than flesh and bone. The impostor took him by the shoulders, lifting him off the ground, and carried him across the room, then pressed him against the wall. She released him and let him stand, turning to look at Charlie momentarily. Then she placed her open palm against John's chest. Suddenly, John began to gasp for breath, his face turning red. The impostor's face remained unchanged, her open hand slowly pressing harder against his chest. "I can't," John gasped for air. "Can't breathe." He clutched at her arm with both hands, but it was no use as she continued to steadily press into him. John slowly began to slide up the wall, inch by inch, the pressure forcing his entire body upward. "Stop!" Charlie cried, but the other Charlie didn't flinch. "Please!" Charlie scrambled to her feet and ran to John's side, but the other Charlie snapped out her other arm and caught her by the neck without moving her hand from John's chest. Her fingers closed on Charlie's throat, closing off her windpipe as she lifted her up onto her toes. Charlie choked, kicking and gasping. The impostor held her there, looking expressionlessly from Charlie to John, as she kept them both immobilized and struggling to breathe. "Okay," Charlie wheezed. "I want to talk. Please," she begged hoarsely. The impostor dropped them both. John fell motionless to the floor. "You've hurt them. Let me help him," Charlie coughed, pulling herself up. "You're so attached to something, so easily broken," she said with amusement. Charlie strained to see past her, anxiously watching John's chest as it rose and fell. "He's alive." Charlie took a breath, then turned to face the girl who hid her face. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked tightly. Carlton let the heavy door slam shut behind him and ran on without looking back. There was another door up ahead, and dim light filtered through a small window near the top. The child's cry echoed again, and Carlton froze, unable to pinpoint its direction. The high-pitched sound pierced the air again, and he grimaced at the sound. It was raw and thin, the scream of a kid who had been screaming for a long time. Carlton peered through the window in the door. It looked deserted, and he opened the door cautiously, then stopped dead. Everything looked the same, every hall, every room. Lights flickered, speakers hummed. One light seemed to be about to burn out, making a high-pitched screech that echoed through the chamber. "Kid," he whispered. But there was no answer, and Carlton was suddenly aware that he may have been chasing echoes and lights for the last 10 minutes. He suddenly felt the weight of how alone he was, and it became a physical thing. The air itself seemed to grow heavier around him. His breath slowed, and he dropped to his knees, then fell back to sit. He stared down the empty hallway despairingly, and finally scooted to the side, maneuvering his back against the wall so that he could at least see his assailant before he died, whoever, or whatever, his assailant might turn out to be. "I failed. I'm not going to find him." Tears sprang to his eyes, unexpectedly. "Michael, I'm so sorry." And the days after Michael disappeared, his father had asked him so many questions, going over that one afternoon, like he believed together they could recreate it and solve the puzzle. "I searched for the missing piece. I promise I searched." He had gone over every moment of the little party in his mind, desperately trying to find the clue his father needed, the detail that would make everything clear. There were so many things he could have done to stop what had happened, if he had known then what he knew now. But now I know it all, and there's still nothing I can do. I failed you, Michael. Carlton put his hand on his chest, trying to calm himself and not hyperventilate. "I failed you again." "So, what do you want to talk about?" Charlie repeated. The other Charlie narrowed her eyes. "That's better. A lot better." The girl smiled, and Charlie leaned back as far away from her as she could. It was unnerving to see her own face glaring back at her, accusatory and petulant. "I'll listen to anything you want to say. Just don't hurt him more," Charlie pleaded, her hands raised in surrender, her heart fluttering. Charlie's duplicate flushed with anger. "This is why," she hissed, shaking her finger accusingly. "What? This is why?" "I don't understand," Charlie cried. Charlie's impostor paced the floor, her anger seeming to have drained as quickly as it came. Charlie took the opportunity to look to John again, who had rolled partially onto his back, holding his side as though in immense pain, his face still red. "He needs help." "What are you?" Charlie growled, her anger rising at the sight of John. "The question isn't what I am. It's what are you, and what makes you so special?" Over and over again. Charlie's duplicate approached her with renewed anger, grabbing Charlie by the throat once more and lifting her off the ground. She pinned into the wall, baring all her teeth. The ruse of Charlie's impostor faded, revealing a painted clown face, somehow looking angrier than the human facade. The white plates of the face opened like a flower. The face plates closed over the tangle of twisted metal, revealing yet another face, made of coils and wires, with bare black eyes and jagged prongs for teeth. Her real face, Charlie thought. "Ask again," she growled. "What?" Charlie choked. "I said, ask me again." The metal monster snarled. "What are you?" Charlie whimpered. "I told you, that's not the right question." The metal girl held Charlie out at a distance, and looked her up and down. Where did he hide it? She held Charlie's throat with one hand, and put the other hand on Charlie's chest, then ran a finger down the length of her breastbone. Then her eyes shot to Charlie's face, and she grabbed her chin and turned her head forcefully to the side. She seemed lost in thought for only a moment, then snapped back. Ask again. Charlie locked eyes with the metal face, reassembling the face of the clown, with her rosy cheeks and glossy lips. Soon the illusion returned, and Charlie was staring into her own eyes again. Charlie felt herself growing uncannily calm as she began to realize what the right question was. What am I? The imposter loosened her grip and lowered Charlie so that her feet touched the ground. You are nothing, Charlie, the imposter said. You look at me and you see a soulless monster. How ironic, how twisted, how backward. She let go of Charlie's throat and took a step back, her red lips losing their savior for the moment. How unfair. Charlie was on her knees again, struggling to regain her strength. The imposter approached her and knelt with her, placing her hand over Charlie's. Running her fingers through Charlie's hair and firmly grasping the back of her neck. She was a little girl, holding a piece of paper in her hand, excited and full of joy. A bright gold foil star shimmered on the page above the glowing words of her kindergarten teacher. Someone gently touched her back, encouraging her to run forward into the dark. She eagerly ran inside, and there he was, standing by the work desk. How long did I stand there before he shooed me away? Charlie searched her mind, but the answers didn't come. He didn't shoo me away, Charlie's other voice answered. Her eagerness didn't fade. She remained patient and joyful. After the first push, she came back to try again. It was only after the second push that she hesitated to go back, but she carefully returned anyway, this time holding the paper into the air. Maybe he didn't see it. He saw it. Charlie's other voice spoke down to her. This time it hurt. The ground was cold, and her arm ached where she had fallen on it. She looked for the paper. It was on the floor in front of her. Her gold star still shone bright, but it was standing on the page now. She looked up to see if he noticed. Tears in her eyes. She knew she should leave it, but she couldn't. She reached forward to tug at the corner, but it was too far away. She finally crawled to it on her knees, her dress dirty now, and tried to pull the page from under his shoe. It wouldn't come loose. That's when he hit me. It was difficult to make out anything in the room after that. The room was a smear of tears and pain, and her head was still spinning. But she made out one thing: a shiny metal clown doll. Her father had turned his attention back to it, lovingly polishing her. Suddenly, her pain faded to the background, replaced with fascination, obsession. What is all of this? Charlie cried. Now she was looking at herself in the mirror, holding a stick of lipstick that she'd stolen from her teacher's purse, but she wasn't painting her lips with it. She was drawing bright red circles on her cheeks. The lips came next. Are you listening to me? The doppelganger whispered. Night had swept over everything. The rooms were dark. The halls were silent. The lab was still. Her feet made soft pats against the smooth white tiles. A tiny camera in the corner had a red blinking light on it, but it didn't matter what it saw. It was too late to stop her. She pulled the sheet away from the beautiful clown girl, beckoning her to speak. Where was the button, the one he always pressed? The eyes lit up first, and then the other lights from within. It didn't take long for the painted face to search the room and find her, greeting her with a sweet smile and soft voice. Then there was screaming. The illusion was broken, and Charlie pushed herself away. Then there was screaming. The imposter repeated. It was coming from me, but... She paused and pointed to her own head with a look of curiosity. But I remember seeing her scream. She looked thoughtful for a second, and suddenly the illusion dissipated, and she appeared again as the painted clown. It's strange to remember the same moment from two pairs of eyes, but then we were one. I don't believe that story, Charlie growled. I don't believe that story at all. You aren't possessed. If you think I will believe for 1 second that I'm talking to the spirit of a sweet and innocent little girl, then you're crazy. I want you to call me Elizabeth, the girl said softly. Elizabeth, Charlie answered. If you were this little girl, Elizabeth, I can't bring myself to believe. If you were this little girl, Elizabeth, I can't bring myself to believe that that little girl would be capable of all this. The anger isn't from her, Elizabeth said, her painted face shifting. She looked like a wounded animal, vulnerable but still poised to attack. Then what? Charlie cried. My anger is from a different father. Elizabeth strode to Charlie again, grabbing her neck again, and jostling her into a white light in pain, where suddenly all was calm. A hand was stroking her hair. The sun was going down over a field of grain. A cluster of birds were fluttering overhead, their calls echoing out over the landscape. "I'm so happy to be here with you," a kind voice said. She looked up and nestled against him. "No, this is mine," Charlie protested. "No," Elizabeth intruded. "That doesn't belong to you. Let me show you what does belong to you." Agony erupted, flooding the room with its sound. The walls went black, and streams of water poured down from behind the window curtains. A man lay curled on the floor, something cradled tightly in his arms, and when his mouth opened, the room shook with a sound of his anguish. "Who is that?" Charlie said anxiously. "What is he holding?" "You don't recognize her," Elizabeth said. "That's Ella, of course. It's all your father had left after you were taken." "Wait. What? No, that's not Ella." Charlie shook her head. "He cried over that cheap store-bought rag doll for 2 months." Elizabeth snarled with disbelief. "He cried into it. He bled into it. He poured his grief over it. Very unhealthy. He began to treat it as though he still had a daughter. That was my memory. Me sitting with my dad, watching the sun go down. We were waiting for the stars to come out. That's my memory." Charlie said angrily. "Look again," Elizabeth instructed, forcing the image upon her once more. There was a hand stroking her hair. The sun was going down over a field of grain. A cluster of birds were fluttering overhead, their calls echoing out over the landscape. "I'm so happy to be here with you," a kind voice said. He gripped the doll tightly, and smiled despite the tears streaming from his face. Of course he wasn't content with that. You had to grow up, so he made more. Her arms hung off the side of the workbench. The joints were stiff enough to carry something lightweight, and her eyes were more realistic than he had ever made them before. He propped her up and extended her arms straight in front of her, carefully balancing a small tray on them, then setting a teacup on the tray. He furrowed his brow with frustration for a moment, turning a brass knob over and over until the room quivered and flashed. Then everything stood still, and the little girl looked at him and smiled. "That's my memory!" Charlie screamed. "No, this is his memory," Elizabeth corrected. "Jen, I swear, she is more than another animatronic doll. You should see. She walks, and she talks." "Of course she walks and talks, Henry." Jen's voice was angry. "She walks because everything you built can walk, and she talks because everything you built can talk. But the reason why this one seems so real is because you're destroying your mind with these frequencies and codes." Jen threw her arms in the air. "She remembers Jen. She remembers me. She remembers our family. No, Henry, you remember. Zap your head with enough of those rays, and I bet you can tell the tea kettle to tell you about your lost family." "My lost family," Henry repeated. Jen took pause, looking regretful. "It doesn't have to be that way, but you need to let go of this. Your wife, your son, they can still be a part of your life, but you have to let go of this. She is in this doll." He gestured to Ella, who was standing upright with her teacup perched on the tray. A little rag doll sat in a wooden chair in the corner, its head draped over the armrest, its eyes staring out over the room. It took him a while to figure out that it was the rag doll, the little store-bought rag doll. Maybe he never sensed you when it wasn't around. I don't know. But over time, he started putting it inside his Charlie, whatever new Charlie he built. Charlie sat speechless, remembering all the times with her father, questioning each of them, sitting on the floor of his workshop, building a block tower out of scraps of wood. As he bent over his work, he turned back to her and smiled, and she smiled back. Beloved. Her father went back to his work, and the jumbled creature in the far dark corner twitched. Charlie startled, knocking her blocks to the ground, but her father did not seem to hear. She began to rebuild the tower, but the creature kept drawing her gaze, the twisted metal skeleton with its burning silver eyes. It twitched again, and she wanted to ask, but she could not make herself speak the words. "Does it hurt?" Charlie whispered, the image so clear that she could almost smell the hot, metallic scent of the workshop. Elizabeth froze, then all at once the illusion vanished, and the metal plates of her clown-painted face stripped back, burying the coils and wires and jagged teeth. Charlie shrank back and Elizabeth moved with her, maintaining the distance between them. "Yes," she whispered, and her eyes blazed silver. "Yes, it hurt." The plates of her face folded back in, and her eyes still glowed. Charlie blinked and looked away, the light blinding her. Elizabeth stared bitterly, poking pinpoint holes in her vision. "So, you remember me then?" "Yes." Charlie rubbed her eyes as her vision began to clear. "In the corner. I didn't want to look. I thought you were someone else," she said, her voice sounding thin and childish to her own ears. Elizabeth laughed. "Did any of those other things really look like me? I'm unique. Look at me." "It hurt my eyes," Charlie said faintly, and Elizabeth grabbed her by the chin and pulled her close. Charlie shied away, loosening her eyes against the light, and Elizabeth slapped her cheek with painful force. "Look at me." Charlie took a shaky breath and obeyed. Elizabeth's face looked like Charlie's again, but the silver light poured out coldly from the place where her eyes should be. Charlie let it flood her vision, blotting out everything else. "Do you know why my eyes were always glowing?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Do you know why I twitched and shuddered in the dark?" Charlie shook her eyes slightly, and Elizabeth let go of her chin. "It was because your father left me turned on all the time. Every moment, every day, I was aware and unfinished, watching him as the hours passed, and he created toys for the little Charlie, unicorns and bunnies that moved and talked as I hung in the dark, waiting, abandoned." The glare from her eyes faded a little, and Charlie blinked, trying not to show her relief. "Why am I talking to you about this? You weren't even there yet." Elizabeth turned her face, almost in disgust. "I was," Charlie answered. "I was there. I remember." "You remember?" Elizabeth mocked. "Are you sure you were there? For all of those memories?" Charlie searched her thoughts for anything that could confirm the memory she clung to. "Look down," Elizabeth whispered. "What?" Charlie whimpered. "Your memory. I'm sure it's crystal clear, since you were there and all." Elizabeth smiled. "Look down." Charlie returned to her memory, standing in front of her father's workbench. She was immobile. She didn't have a voice. "Look down," Elizabeth whispered again. Charlie looked to her feet, but didn't see feet at all. Only 3 legs of a camera tripod, anchored to the ground. "He was making memories for you, making a life for his little rag doll, making her a real girl. I'm sure many of those memories have been elaborated upon, edited, and embellished, but make no mistake, Charlie wasn't there." Elizabeth leaned closer to Charlie. "He made us 1, 2, 3." Elizabeth touched Charlie's shoulder lightly, then brought her hand back to her own chest. 4. Her eyes flickered, and the silver glow faded until her eyes looked nearly human. Charlie would be a baby, then a little girl, and then a sulky teenager. She looked Charlie up and down with a pointed sneer. Then her expression cleared as she continued. "Then at last she would be a woman. She would be finished. Perfect. Me." Elizabeth's face tightened. But something changed as Henry labored, racked with grief, over his little girl. The littlest Charlotte was made with a broken heart. She cried all the time, day and night. The second Charlotte he made when he was at the depth of madness, almost believing the lies he told himself. She was as hopelessly desperate for her father's love as he was for hers. The third Charlotte he made when he began to realize he'd gone mad, when he questioned every thought he had, and begged his sister Jen to remind him what was real. The third Charlotte was strange. Elizabeth gave Charlie a contemptuous look, but Charlie scarcely saw it. The third Charlotte was strange. She repeated it silently. She ducked her head and rubbed the flannel of her father's shirt with her thumb, then looked back up. Elizabeth's face was stiff with rage. She was nearly trembling. "What about the fourth?" Charlie asked, hesitantly. "There was no fourth," she snapped. "When Henry began to make the fourth, his despair turned to rage. He seethed as he soldered his skeleton together, pouring his anger into the forge, where he shaped her very bones. I was not Charlotte drenched in grief. I was made alive with Henry's fury." Her eyes fled again with silver light, and Charlie stayed herself, forcing herself not to blink. Elizabeth leaned in closer, her face inches from Charlie's. "Do you know the first words your father ever spoke to me?" she hissed. Charlie shook her head minutely. "She said to me,
You are wrong. He tried to fix the flaw he saw in me at first, but what was wrong, as Henry saw it, was the very thing that made me alive. Rage, Charlie said softly. Rage. Elizabeth drew herself up and shook her head. My father abandoned me. Her face twitched. Henry abandoned me. She corrected herself. Of course, I could not comprehend those memories until I had received a soul of my own. Once I took it for myself, she smiled. Once I had endowed myself with a soul, I experienced those memories anew, not as an uncomprehending toy, twitching and seizing with an all-consuming rage I could not fathom, but as a person, as a daughter. It's a rather cruel irony that I would escape the life of one neglected daughter, only to embody another. Charlie was silent, and for a moment her father's face returned to her, her smile that was always so sad. Elizabeth laughed abruptly, shaking her out of her memories. You're not Charlie either, you know. You're not even the soul of Charlie, Elizabeth mocked. You aren't even a person. You're a ghost of a man's regret. You're what's left of a man who lost everything. You're the sad little tears that fell unceremoniously into a door that used to belong to Charlie. Elizabeth suddenly glared at her, as if looking through her, and if I had to take a guess, she grabbed Charlie under her chin and pulled her upright, studying her torso for a moment. She made a quick motion with her other hand, and Charlie gasped. The room was spinning again. Elizabeth's hand had disappeared, but it soon re-emerged, and she was holding something. Look, before you lose consciousness, Elizabeth whispered. There, before Charlie's eyes, was a rag doll, and recognition flared. Ella, she tried to whisper, this is you. The room went dark. What was that? Carlton lifted his head, holding his breath as he waited to hear it again. After a moment he did. Someone was whimpering, and the sound was coming from nearby. Carlton took in a renewed gulp of air, instantly filled with new purpose. After hours of flickering bulbs and distant echoes, this was right beside him. Carlton leapt to his feet. Across the hall a door was ajar, with an orange light glowing unsteadily from inside. How did I not notice that? Carlton made his way across the hall, sliding his feet along the floor so as not to make a sound. When he reached the door, he peered in cautiously through the crack. The orange light was from an opened furnace set into the wall, its mouth large enough to fit a small car. The furnace was the only light in the dark room, but he could make out a long table with something dark lying on it. The whimpering came again, and this time Carlton's eyes lit on its source. A small blond-haired boy was huddled in the darkest corner of the room, opposite the furnace. Carlton ran into the room and knelt beside the boy, who looked up at him numbly. He was bleeding from shallow cuts on his arm and one corner of his mouth, but Carlton saw no other visible injuries. Hey, he whispered nervously. Are you okay? The boy didn't respond, and Carlton took hold of his arms, readying to pick him up. When he touched the child, he could feel the tremors through his body. He's terrified. Come on, we're getting out of here, Carlton said. The little boy pointed to the creature on the table. Save him too, the boy whispered tearfully. He hurts so bad. He squeezed his eyes shut. Carlton glanced at the large, motionless figure on the table by the furnace. He hadn't considered that it might be a person. He scanned the room to make sure nothing else was moving, then patted the boy on the shoulder as he got to his feet. He approached the table cautiously, keeping to the wall instead of walking across the center of the room. As he got closer, the burning smell of metal and oil rushed up against him, and he covered his face with his sleeve, trying not to gag as he examined the prone figure. It's not a person. On the table, illuminated by the flickering orange light, was a mass of metal, a melted, clumpy skeleton of metal bulges and blobs, barely resembling anything at all. Carlton studied the thing for a long moment, then looked back at the little boy, uncertain what to say. Heat, a voice snarled, and Carlton spun around to face a twisted man, creeping out from the shadows. Heat is the key to all of this, the man went on as he haltingly approached the table. If you keep all this at just the right temperature, it's malleable, it's moldable, and it's highly, highly effective. Or maybe contagious is the word. I suspect you could put it in anything, but it's best to put it into something that you can control, at least to a certain extent.
William Afton lurched into the light, and Carlton stepped back reflexively, though the table was between them. "It's an interesting alchemy," William continued. "You can make something that you control completely, but that has no will of its own. Like a gun, I suppose." He ran his withered hand over the silver arm of the creature. "Or you can take a drop of pixie dust," he smiled, "and you can create a monster that you mostly control, one with unlimited potential. Carlton." He stepped